Character writing is one of the most complex topics in the creation of fiction. People themselves are infinitely complex, so in trying to create believable mirrors of them, there is an almost endless span of options for what you can do with them. But there are archetypes that share similarities, and I want to discuss a few of them, with today's being the cleric or priest archetype, as was suggested by a commenter. I wanted to start with these guys because more than any other archetype, they tend to be hammered into one almost universal trope that makes a lot of characters that fall into this category kind of boring. And I want to discuss all the ways that doing that is kind of unnecessary. When written well, a cleric or priest archetype can be interesting in ways that a lot of other characters probably wouldn't be, and compressing them all into fanatic zealot or personality-less rule follower is leaving a lot of possibilities on the table. Hopefully by the end of this video, your next cleric for D&D or archbishop for your recently world-built religion will be a little bit more interesting. More than a lot of archetypes, clerics are externally shaped. Of course, this will be in part by the religion that they follow itself, but also by the institution that shapes that religion and how it's taught. I have videos on that topic if you want to write religions in of themselves, but in essence, clerics are inherently impacted by that belief system that they're a part of, obviously. Crucially, however, this does not mean that their personality is consumed by that belief system by default. The ways in which they might be impacted by their religion will be bespoke to that religion and its values. A priest following a god of law and order will probably value those things disproportionately, and you probably wouldn't expect such a follower to be an anarchist or take up work as a bandit, though deliberately choosing to contrast a priest's beliefs and actions is actually one of the best ways to add some intrigue to them, so long as it's appropriate, and we will touch on that more later. For the time being, before we talk about some sub-archetypes that'll really narrow down our focus, I want to talk about the institutions that clerics are a part of and their place in it, because we really need to define what kind of priests that we're actually talking about. A tribe's shaman and the leader of a continent-spanning faith both fall under the catch-all umbrella of religious figure, but they are very different because of their relationship with institutions. And so we'll be saving a more shaman or wise man or cult leader-esque type of person for another video. Today we're focusing on those who are part of an established, organized religion and subtypes one might see in those structures, which for our purposes we're going to be calling the cleric, the monk, the crusader, the theologian, and the archbishop. While I'm couching these in vaguely Catholicism-shaped titles, that's just because that's where my historical knowledge mostly lies, and because it should be relatively understandable as to what I'm talking about. And all that said, one of the main forms of valid criticism of fictional religions and fantasy is that they appear as medieval Catholicism with the serial numbers filed off, which, while understandable, is obviously not the only way you can do things, even if you're doing a hierarchical, organized religion. Even when people base their religious figures vaguely off Christianity, they tend not to do it very well anyway. And so we'll be discussing these kinds of ranks in fairly broad terms. The cleric speaks for their faith, the monk lives for their faith, the crusader fights for their faith, the theologian thinks for their faith, and the archbishop leads for their faith. This is the basis from which we're working. Starting with clerics/priests themselves, these are the standard examples of this archetype when people think of a priest, especially in fantasy settings. These range from a temple's local preacher to a clerk administrating the affairs of their organization to a missionary spreading their faith in lands foreign to their beliefs. The core idea, the principle behind a cleric as we're defining it here, is their charisma. To be a cleric is to be ordained, educated, or otherwise qualified to speak on religious matters, whatever that might mean for their particular faith. It often comes to them to maintain the faith of their religion's followers or to spread it to others. They often lack much power over their institution itself and can have a wide variety of interactions with secular government. Sometimes they'll almost be completely immune to the laws that lay people are subject to. At other times, they'll be under heavy scrutiny. They might be held to higher standards than most due to their holy position, or perhaps able to get away with things others can't because their position is legally untouchable. Either way, the cleric is public-facing in some way or another and meets the world world with their words. As characters, priests/clerics might have some of the greatest possibility for variation within a religious structure. They are both a position of religious authority, even if that authority is limited, and yet also someone who will operate on a fairly local basis, likely preaching to a particular town or district or something like that. Some of them might be your archetypical rule-following Puritan, but there's also the potential for characters like Father Godwin from Kingdom Come Deliverance, who is probably one of the best priest characters I've encountered in media. He's a drunk, he has a mistress on the side despite being an ordained Catholic priest, and yet he's also a master swordsman and fundamentally a pretty okay guy. None of those qualities would be found in your archetypical priest, and yet he is both believable as being a priest while also actually being interesting. He's also a great example of the general idea that with every character there should be flaws. While I do think the comically evil, zealous priest is sort of an overdone trope, it does have reasons to exist, even thematically, and it largely comes down to the fact that while everyone is flawed, a priest is someone in your own backyard, not a king or a pope or some other such distant figure, who is still meant to live a pure life, whatever that means by the religion standards. But nobody is perfect, and so when you have that kind of character being flawed, it can have some additional weight to it. It's typically the ways that a priest is flawed that will best help accentuate both their greatest strengths and failings. Characters like Father Godwin are so interesting because he is so very flawed and yet so very great at the same time. Priests get a bad rap as characters when they are entirely pure and thus devoid of nuance or personality, or entirely evil and thus devoid of nuance and personality, especially when, because they're a concept so strongly tied up in one's own personal beliefs, priests are written as entirely good or entirely evil because that's how the creator views all priests to be, without allowing room for J-Bat's favorite word, nuance. It's one of the reasons this is the archetype I'm trying this video format with, because for one reason or another, clerics and priests seem the most likely to be boring characters because they are too rarely written with nuance, either being personality devoid fonts of their religious doctrine, or zealots who would burn down a house because there's a speck of dust in the threshold. But as I'm emphasizing with these videos, those are not the only religiously relevant types of people even to write. The next that we're going to talk about is the monk or nun. Despite monks and nuns being essentially equivalent concepts when speaking generally, they do actually tend to have some varying conceptions between the two. When people think of monks, they most often think of the D&D-esque, vaguely Tibetan martial artist, and when people think of nuns, they either think of a sweet old woman or a curmudgeonly Catholic school teacher. But in reality, there were warrior nuns that changed the course of battles, and scholastic monks who were essentially responsible for the foundations of most modern science, and the only reason most of what we know about antiquity is still preserved for you to look at now. As I said earlier, monks/nuns are those who live for their faith. What sets them apart from a more priestly type is their internality. It is a priest's job to be outward-facing, to minister to or convert others. Monks and nuns are not in the business of conversion, whatever their actual duties might look like. They are for living in the service of their beliefs. If people are converted because of them, it's because they are doing it from their example, not from their teaching. You have real-life groups, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get really nerdy about medieval monks here, but bear with me. Groups like the Franciscans and the Bejuans, for example, lived simple lives and sought poverty and to serve those around them, often being prime sources of charity in their times. Others, like the Benedictines, were responsible oftentimes for copying ancient texts and thus preserving them. It's from institutions like those we see our theologian class religious figures like Thomas Aquinas, or even scientists like Gregor Mendel. One thing that tends, though not always, to unite these groups is that whether we're talking Augustinian or Tibetan monks, is asceticism. Though to what exact extent this is prioritized may vary, monks tend to in some way value the spiritual far above the material. Manual labor is often involved either as a means of self-preservation, as a way of growing closer to the faith through physical stress, or as a means to support their institutions, as was the case with the Carthusians. Given these facts, and that many, though not really most, monks tend to isolate themselves into their own communities, monks, at least not accurate kinds, aren't always that common as characters. I, for one, think we could do with taking some inspiration from the Franciscans in our world building, as they traveled the world and were so unlike the more rigidly structured Benedictines that St. Francis himself didn't even want to write down his guidelines for how he lived. I want more characters like that in fiction. While monks aren't likely to be the type to go out actively converting people, where they can be seen, the religion they follow can be experienced. You can see what it is that their faith sees as the ideal way to live if one is to commit themselves all the way to it, and that might end up being one of the best ways to demonstrate what that faith is actually supposed to embody to your audience. But before we move on to our next archetype, let's hear a word from our sponsor, World Anvil. Writing is complicated. World building is complicated, especially when you're working with sci-fi, fantasy, or other speculative fiction genres. Keeping track of all the relevant information from characters to countries to magic systems can be tricky, and it's very easy to get very disorganized. World Anvil might just be the solution to those problems. It's got a ready-made template and format for all your writing and world building needs, making it easy to get all your information down and keep it in proper order. Need templates to keep track of character information? World Anvil's got it. Need an interactive map so you can develop the unique personality of each country, town, and village? World Anvil covers that. Need templates for magic systems? Once again, World Anvil has come prepared. Even timelines feature as something World Anvil can help you organize, and let me tell you, the histories of fantasy worlds get very detailed, and having a visual indicator to keep it all straight can be invaluable. All put together, it can really get you that wiki vibe where all your world building is part of a solid ecosystem, where you can jump from one topic to the next with ease and add to any given subtopic as needed. So, if World Anvil sounds like the answer to your writing and world building needs, check them out at worldanvil.com and use the coupon code JBAT for a 51% off discount on any yearly membership. That's worldanvil.com, which will be linked in the description below. Once again, that's code JBAT for a 51% off an annual plan, and thank you for not skipping the ad. So now we can move on to our next archetype, which can be related to the monk, and that is the Crusader. I'm using that term to refer to any type of character who is a warrior for religious reasons, and for religious ends. Your clerics in a D&D sense probably fall somewhere into this category, or are a mixture between this and the cleric of earlier. Either way, these characters tend to basically be compressed into a number of memes and stereotypes, which isn't totally unreasonable, as some of the things our historical examples of these did were fairly absurd, but there is a lot of potential to do new kinds of things with Crusader-type characters. It's also a very broad category in terms of what can land someone here. The Sohei of feudal Japan fall under this category just as much as Teutonic Knights do. Throughout history, there have typically been about three things that wars are fought over: politics, money, and religion, and most often it's some sort of a combination of those three. The Fourth Crusade and the Albigensian Crusades, for example, were prime instances of conflicts initiated for holy purposes, but that ended up, in effect, being mostly about money at the end of the day. In the prior case, Crusaders shipped off to help the Byzantines ended up burning Constantinople and pillaging it, and even overthrowing the Byzantines for a time. In the latter case, while the Cathar targets of the Albigensian Crusades were supposedly wiped out, the main identifiable results were that Simon de Montfort took a lot of land from a whole bunch of guys named Raymond, and southern France became a part of the Kingdom of France, even though a lot of it was burned down in the process. And so, when you write a Crusader-esque character, the main thing for you to consider is what exactly their personal motivation is. While in the large scale, such conflicts are often bent away from their original intent, when more profitable options arise, the individual foot soldiers of such a conflict might do it for any number of reasons that they maintain: for adventure, for plunder, or maybe because of a real devotion to whatever cause it is that they believe in. These kinds of conflicts of interest can get really interesting in new ways when dealing with fictional settings as well, because while in reality most religious conflicts aren't typically viewed very positively in retrospect, in a fantasy setting, a crusade against, say, demon worshippers capable of summoning monstrosities to plunder the land might seem pretty well justified. But just because the cause is more evidently right, even to an outsider audience, doesn't mean that those same kinds of conflicts of interests might not show up. Propaganda, of course, is also a big part of making a person into a crusader type. Despite the two main tenets of a religion like Christianity essentially being to love God and love others, one can still read the writings of popes or agitators like Bernard of Clairvaux and see how those principles are twisted into justifications for why some people are beyond conversion, and the only thing to do with said people is convert them from living to dead. Crusaders are interesting because crusades and/or holy wars are very messy, and when one's fundamental beliefs in the shape of the world are put at stake and become the ammunition of the conflict, it's no wonder they escalate. The Crusades themselves were really just a midpoint in a long span of conflict between Islamic and Christian factions that started 400 years before the First Crusade. And even World War I, 800 years after the main body of the Crusades had finished, was fought with religious connotations on the fronts that involved the Ottomans, such as when the British took Jerusalem from them in 1917. It was seen as the conclusion to the Crusades after centuries. This section really is making me think I should do a whole video on holy wars. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. But to close out this section, a crusader can be anyone. From a lowly peasant as seen in the People's Crusade, to a game of the lords of entire continents, all things considered, they have the potential to be some of the most dynamic characters you can write as combatants in one of the most complex types of wars. And now we've got our fourth archetype, the theologian. Oh god, theology, you might reasonably say. In the same way that writing in-world philosophy from in-world philosophers might be a bit much for even the hardiest of world builders, this is an archetype that has a purpose for any world in which its religions play a semi-important role, even if not in the ways you might initially expect. A theologian at heart is someone who is meant to understand how their chosen religion intersects with the observed world. While they aren't the ones preaching to crowds, it is their ideas that filter through their institution's doctrine until it becomes a core foundation of their beliefs. I could ramble here about the history of Christian theology first being based off of Plato's works through Anselm of Canterbury, and how it changed as Aristotle came more into use in monastic orders, as seen with Thomas Aquinas, but only the truly invested or the truly deranged like me would sit through that. So in essence, writing a theologian-esque character is writing someone who seeks, as a part of your world, to understand your world and how the religions you've written into it interact with that world. Think of it this way. If you can't imagine a guy who in the world is very smart and well studied figuring out a sensible way for his religion to intersect with reality, then there might be something worth changing there. Perhaps the character should just convert religions because his doesn't make sense to him. Perhaps the religion you wrote itself doesn't quite make sense and that should be changed. Maybe the religion you've written is supposed to be incomprehensible or nonsensical to humans, in which case you can have just as much fun with this character by frustrating him to no end because he can't understand it even though the things he believes are still true. Either way, the theologian, as much as they can be a character, is also a bit of a thought exercise for you as a creator, to see if, when viewed from the other side of the one-way mirror, your world can be made sense of. Otherwise, in a more grounded sense, they also work well for wise old mentor-type characters, someone who understands the way of things in the world and can impart that knowledge upon a protagonist. But discussing mentors in full would obviously be a video of its own. Finally, we have the Archbishop category. While most of the terms we've been using are titled around the vaguely medieval Catholic fare we see in fantasy, the Archbishop is capable of all sorts of variation dependent entirely on what it means to be in charge of their religion. Especially as, for some religions, it isn't really possible for there to just be an archbishop-type figure. Some just aren't that centralized, and even the highest authority is more comparable to a standard priest with some extra duties than someone who's all the way in charge of an entire institution. The next big point of variance to think about is how much secular power your archbishop character controls. And while that might sound as simple as, do they own a lot of land or not? There are a lot of ways such a figure can express power. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Pope didn't actually have as much legal power over monarchs as you'd maybe expect, but the soft power, the way that the whims of such a culturally crucial figure could shape other people's reputations and lives, made the lack of as much legal power almost unimportant. Excommunications, though done entirely outside most actual realms' legal systems, were still ruinous even for very powerful monarchs. I mean, what better justification could there be for someone to rebel than to want to overthrow an excommunicated king. So all that in mind, writing an archbishop as a character is just as much writing an archbishop as it is a position. How much power do they have? How do they use it? Are they content with their religion's place in society? Say you have an archbishop type character in a society where a lot of people follow their religion, but the ruling class despises it. Perhaps they are conquerors from another land or have recently converted to a smaller religion. What's the archbishop's responsibility there? What are their obligations to the state, and do they supersede their obligations to the people or their own faith? If such questions are being asked, this archbishop may well be the target of assassinations by the ruling class, who might seek a more amenable or right-believing figure for that role. I bring up all these hypotheticals because an archbishop, even one who does have a lot of secular power, should have different things in mind when compared to your regular king, dictator, president, or what have you. The spiritual well-being of their people, the upkeeping of their faith and institutions, and especially in settings with active gods, keeping those deities pleased, are all going to be on such a figure's mind. It's a lot of pressure, and only a certain kind of person is going to be able to take up that kind of mantle. And naturally, these characters are people too, and will surely have flaws of their own. And if it reflects really badly on a regular priest to be found out having unsavory tendencies, imagine what happens if it turns out the leader of an entire religion is acting against their beliefs. That whole religion could be shaken or broken by such an outcome. And then, of course, that speaks to a question of legitimacy. Is such an institution for the maintenance of this religion actually in line with the religion's teachings? Is the way in which the institution is led in line with its teachings? It's often an archbishop-type character's job to oversee differing sects of their belief and determine whether or not those beliefs are actually admissible with what the church teaches. Are they more lenient and risk the religion fracturing and conflict starting? Or are they more strict and end up making their religion an overbearing presence in the people's lives that they begin to resent? Ultimately, writing religious figures is every bit as complex as writing religions, but it's often through these figures that the religion itself can be figured out. These are people who experience that religion every day and in different ways, and through them you can show the audience what they're meant to see about this faith. They are one of the best ways to expand your world building through characters, especially when we're talking about world building in a cosmological sense. And so, I hope this video was hopeful or interesting to you in helping to expand this archetype of characters into something more than it has been in the past. Anyway, if this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we try to post all our videos early. As we close out, I'd like to thank our patrons: Shadowrunner, Sani, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don, Sadako, Cavalier, and Sazabi of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion and Jody on Void, our Knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria, Lauren, and Noah, our loyal squires. And remember, no matter what religion you're writing, they should use harpsichords in their services, because harpsichords are cool.